Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 1. The Preliminaries of Seeing. I returned to Don Juan's house on October 3, 1968, for the sole purpose of asking him about the events surrounding Eligio's initiation. An almost endless stream of questions had occurred to me while rereading the account of what took place then. I was after very precise explanations, so I made a list of questions beforehand, carefully choosing the most appropriate words. I began by asking him, "Did I see that night, Don Juan?" "You almost did." "Did you see that I was seeing Eligio's movements?" "Yes." "I saw that Mescalito was allowing you to see part of Eligio's lesson, otherwise you would have been looking at a man sitting there, or perhaps lying there. During the last minute you did not notice that the men were doing anything, did you?" At the last minute I had not noticed any of the men performing movements out of the ordinary. I told him I could safely say that all I had recorded in my notes was that some of them got up and went to the bushes more often than others. "But you nearly saw Eligio's entire lesson," Don Juan went on. "Think about that. Do you understand now how generous Mescalito is with you? Mescalito has never been so gentle with anyone, to my knowledge. Not anyone. And yet you have no regard for his generosity. How can you turn your back on him so bluntly? Or perhaps I should say, in exchange for what are you turning your back on Mescalito?" I felt that Don Juan was cornering me again. I was unable to answer his question. I had always believed I had quit the apprenticeship in order to save myself, yet I had no idea from what I was saving myself, or for what. I wanted to change the direction of our conversation quickly, and to that end I abandoned my intention to carry on with all my pre-calculated questions, and brought out my most important query. "I wonder if you could tell me more about your controlled folly," I said. "What do you want to know about it? Please tell me, Don Juan, what exactly is controlled folly?" Don Juan laughed loudly and made a smacking sound by slapping his thigh with the hollow of his hand. "This is controlled folly," he said, and laughed and slapped his thigh again. "What do you mean?" "I am happy that you finally asked me about my controlled folly after so many years, and yet it wouldn't have mattered to me in the least if you had never asked. Yet I have chosen to feel happy, as if I cared, that you asked, as if it would matter that I care. That is controlled folly." We both laughed very loudly. I hugged him. I found his explanation delightful, although I did not quite understand it. We were sitting, as usual, in the area right in front of the door of his house. It was mid-morning. Don Juan had a pile of seeds in front of him and was picking the debris from them. I had offered to help him, but he had turned me down. He said the seeds were a gift for one of his friends in central Mexico, and I did not have enough power to touch them. "With whom do you exercise controlled folly, Don Juan?" I asked after a long silence. He chuckled. "With everybody," he exclaimed, smiling. "When do you choose to exercise it, then?" "Every single time I act." I felt I needed to recapitulate at that point, and I asked him if controlled folly meant that his acts were never sincere, but were only the acts of an actor. "My acts are sincere," he said, "but they are only the acts of an actor." "Then everything you do must be controlled folly," I said, truly surprised. "Yes, everything," he said. But it can't be true, I protested, that every one of your acts is only controlled folly. Why not? He replied with a mysterious look. That would mean that nothing matters to you, and you don't really care about anything or anybody. Take me, for example. Do you mean that you don't care whether or not I become a man of knowledge, or whether I live, or die, or do anything? True. I don't. You are like Lucio, or everybody else in my life, my controlled folly. I experienced a peculiar feeling of emptiness. Obviously, there was no reason in the world why Don Juan had to care about me, but on the other hand, I had almost the certainty that he cared about me personally. I thought it could not be otherwise, since he had always given me his undivided attention during every moment I had spent with him. It occurred to me that perhaps Don Juan was just saying that because he was annoyed with me. After all, I had quit his teachings. I have the feeling we are not talking about the same thing, I said. I shouldn't have used myself as an example. What I meant to say was that there must be something in the world you care about in a way that is not controlled folly. I don't think it is possible to go on living if nothing really matters to us. That applies to you, he said. Things matter to you. You asked me about my controlled folly, and I told you that everything I do in regard to myself and my fellow men is folly, because nothing matters. My point is, Don Juan, that if nothing matters to you, how can you go on living? He laughed, and after a moment's pause, in which he seemed to deliberate whether or not to answer, he got up and went to the back of his house. I followed him. Wait, Don Juan. I said. I really want to know. You must explain to me what you mean. Perhaps it's not possible to explain, he said. Certain things in your life matter to you because they're important. Your acts are certainly important to you. But for me, not a single thing is important any longer, neither my acts nor the acts of any of my fellow men. I go on living, though, because I have my will. Because I have tempered my will throughout my life until it's neat and wholesome, and now it doesn't matter to me that nothing matters. My will controls the folly of my life. He squatted and ran his fingers on some herbs that he had put to dry in the sun on a big piece of burlap. I was bewildered. Never would I have anticipated the direction that my query had taken. After a long pause, I thought of a good point. I told him that in my opinion some of the acts of my fellow men were of supreme importance. I pointed out that a nuclear war was definitely the most dramatic example of such an act. I said that for me destroying life on the face of the earth was an act of staggering enormity. You believe that because you're thinking. You're thinking about life, Don Juan said with a glint in his eyes. You're not seeing. Would I feel differently if I could see? I asked. Once a man learns to see, he finds himself alone in the world with nothing but folly, Don Juan said cryptically. He paused for a moment and looked at me as if he wanted to judge the effect of his words. Your acts, as well as the acts of your fellow men in general, appear to be important to you, because you have learned to think they are important. He used the word learned with such a peculiar inflection that it forced me to ask what he meant by it. He stopped handling his plants and looked at me. We learn to think about everything, he said, and then we train our eyes to look as we think about the things we look at. We look at ourselves already thinking that we are important. And therefore we've got to feel important. But then when a man learns to see, he realizes that he can no longer think about the things he looks at, And if he cannot think about what he looks at, everything becomes unimportant. Don Juan must have noticed my puzzled look and repeated his statements 3 times, as if to make me understand them. What he said sounded to me like gibberish at first, but upon thinking about it, his words loomed more like a sophisticated statement about some facet of perception. I tried to think of a good question that would make him clarify his point, but I could not think of anything. All of a sudden I felt exhausted and could not formulate my thoughts clearly. Don Juan seemed to notice my fatigue and patted me gently. "Clean these plants here," he said, "and then shred them carefully into this jar." He handed me a large coffee jar and left. He returned to his house hours later, in the late afternoon. I had finished shredding his plants and had plenty of time to write my notes. I wanted to ask him some questions right off, but he was not in any mood to answer me. He said he was famished and had to fix his food first. He lit a fire in his earthen stove and set up a pot with bone broth stock. He looked in the bag of groceries I had brought and took some vegetables, sliced them into small pieces, and dumped them into the pot. Then he lay on his mat, kicked off his sandals, and told me to sit closer to the stove so I could feed the fire. It was almost dark. From where I sat I could see the sky to the west. The edges of some thick cloud formations were tinted with a deep buff, while the center of the clouds remained almost black. I was going to make a comment on how beautiful the clouds were, but he spoke first. "Fluffy edges and a thick core," he said, pointing at the clouds. His statement was so perfectly apropos that it made me jump. "I was just going to tell you about the clouds," I said. "Then I beat you to it," he said, and laughed with childlike abandon. I asked him if he was in a mood to answer some questions. "What do you want to know?" He replied. "What you told me this afternoon about controlled folly has disturbed me very much," I said. "I really cannot understand what you meant." "Of course you cannot understand it," he said. "You are trying to think about it, and what I said does not fit with your thoughts." "I'm trying to think about it," I said, "because that's the only way I personally can understand anything." "For example, Don Juan, do you mean that once a man learns to see, everything in the whole world is worthless?" "I didn't say worthless. I said unimportant. Everything is equal and therefore unimportant. For example, there is no way for me to say that my acts are more important than yours, or that one thing is more essential than another, therefore all things are equal, and by being equal they are unimportant." I asked him if his statements were a pronouncement that what he had called seeing was in effect a better way than merely looking at things. He said that the eyes of man could perform both functions, but neither of them was better than the other. However, to train the eyes only to look was, in his opinion, an unnecessary loss. "For instance, we need to look with our eyes to laugh," he said, "because only when we look at things can we catch the funny edge of the world. On the other hand, when our eyes see, everything is so equal that nothing is funny." "Do you mean, Don Juan, that a man who sees cannot ever laugh?" He remained silent for some time. "Perhaps there are men of knowledge who never laugh," he said. "I don't know any of them, though. Those I know see and also look, so they laugh. Would a man of knowledge cry as well?" "I suppose so. Our eyes look so we may laugh, or cry, or rejoice, or be sad, or be happy. I personally don't like to be sad, so whenever I witness something that would ordinarily make me sad, I simply shift my eyes and see it instead of looking at it, But when I encounter something funny I look and I laugh. But then, Don Juan, your laughter is real and not controlled folly. Don Juan stared at me for a moment. I talk to you because you make me laugh, he said. You remind me of some bushy-tailed rats of the desert that get caught when they stick their tails in holes, trying to scare other rats away in order to steal their food. You get caught in your own questions. Watch out. Sometimes those rats yank their tails off trying to pull themselves free. I found his comparison funny and I laughed. Don Juan had once shown me some small rodents with bushy tails that looked like fat squirrels. The image of one of those chubby rats yanking its tail off was sad and at the same time morbidly funny. My laughter, as well as everything I do, is real, he said, but it also is controlled folly because it is useless, it changes nothing, and yet I still do it. But as I understand it, Don Juan, your laughter is not useless. It makes you happy. No. I am happy because I choose to look at things that make me happy, and then my eyes catch their funny edge, and I laugh. I have said this to you countless times. One must always choose the path with heart in order to be at one's best, perhaps so one can always laugh. I interpreted what he had said as meaning that crying was inferior to laughter, or at least perhaps an act that weakened us. He asserted that there was no intrinsic difference, and that both were unimportant. He said, however, that his preference was laughter, because laughter made his body feel better than crying. At that point I suggested that if one has a preference there is no equality. If he preferred laughing to crying, the former was indeed more important. He stubbornly maintained that his preference did not mean they were not equal, and I insisted that our argument could be logically stretched to saying that if things were supposed to be so equal, why not also choose death? Many men of knowledge do that, he said. One day they may simply disappear. People may think that they have been ambushed and killed because of their doings. They choose to die because it doesn't matter to them. On the other hand, I choose to live and to laugh, not because it matters, but because that choice is the bent of my nature. The reason I say I choose is because I see, but it isn't that I choose to live. My will makes me go on living in spite of anything I may see. You don't understand me now because of your habit of thinking as you look and thinking as you think. This statement intrigued me very much. I asked him to explain what he meant by it. He repeated the same construct various times, as if giving himself time to arrange it in different terms, and then delivered his point, saying that by thinking, he meant the constant idea that we have of everything in the world. He said that seeing dispelled that habit, and until I learned to see, I could not really understand what he meant. But if nothing matters, Don Juan, why should it matter that I learn to see? I told you once that our lot as men is to learn, for good or bad, he said. I have learned to see and I tell you that nothing really matters. Now it is your turn. Perhaps someday you will see and you will know then whether things matter or not. For me nothing matters, but perhaps for you everything will. You should know by now that a man of knowledge lives by acting, not by thinking about acting, nor by thinking about what he will think when he has finished acting. A man of knowledge chooses a path with heart and follows it, and then he looks and rejoices and laughs, and then he sees and knows. He knows that his life will be over altogether too soon. He knows that he, as well as everybody else, is not going anywhere. He knows, because he sees, that nothing is more important than anything else. In other words, a man of knowledge has no honor, no dignity, no family, no name, no country, but only life to be lived, and under these circumstances his only tie to his fellow men is his controlled folly. Thus a man of knowledge endeavors and sweats and puffs, and if one looks at him he is just like any ordinary man, except that the folly of his life is under control. Nothing being more important than anything else, a man of knowledge chooses any act and acts it out as if it matters to him. His controlled folly makes him say that what he does matters and makes him act as if it did, and yet he knows that it doesn't, so when he fulfills his acts he retreats in peace, and whether his acts were good or bad, or worked or didn't, is in no way part of his concern. A man of knowledge may choose, on the other hand, to remain totally impassive and never act, and behave as if to be impassive really matters to him. He will be rightfully true at that too, because that would also be his controlled folly. I involved myself at this point in a very complicated effort to explain to Don Juan that I was interested in knowing what would motivate a man of knowledge to act in a particular way, in spite of the fact that he knew nothing mattered. He chuckled softly before answering. "You think about your acts," he said. "Therefore you have to believe your acts are as important as you think they are, when in reality nothing of what one does is important." Nothing? But then if nothing really matters, as you asked me, how can I go on living? It would be simple to die, that's what you say and believe, because you're thinking about life, just as you're thinking now what seeing would be like. You wanted me to describe it to you so you could begin to think about it, the way you do with everything else. In the case of seeing, however, thinking is not the issue at all, so I cannot tell you what it is like to see. Now you want me to describe the reasons for my controlled folly, and I can only tell you that controlled folly is very much like seeing, it is something you cannot think about. He yawned. He lay on his back and stretched his arms and legs. His bones made a cracking sound. "You have been away too long," he said. "You think too much." He got up and walked into the thick chaparral at the side of the house. I fed the fire to keep the pot boiling. I was going to light a kerosene lantern, but the semi-darkness was very soothing. The fire from the stove, which supplied enough light to write, also created a reddish glow all around me. I put my notes on the ground and lay down. I felt tired. Out of the whole conversation with Don Juan, the only poignant thing in my mind was that he did not care about me. It disturbed me immensely. Over a period of years I had put my trust in him. Had I not had complete confidence in him, I would have been paralyzed with fear at the prospect of learning his knowledge. The premise on which I had based my trust was the idea that he cared about me personally. Actually, I had always been afraid of him, but I had kept my fear in check because I trusted him. When he removed that basis, I had nothing to fall back on, and I felt helpless. A very strange anxiety possessed me. I became extremely agitated and began pacing up and down in front of the stove. Don Juan was taking a long time. I waited for him impatiently. He returned a while later. He sat down again in front of the fire, and I blurted out my fears. I told him that I worried because I was incapable of changing directions in midstream. I explained to him that together with the trust I had in him, I had also learned to respect and to regard his way of life as being intrinsically more rational, or at least more functional, than mine. I said that his words had plunged me into a terrible conflict because they entailed my having to change my feelings. To illustrate my point, I told Don Juan the story of an old man of my culture, a very wealthy, conservative lawyer who lived his life convinced that he upheld the truth. In the early 30s, with the advent of the New Deal, he found himself passionately involved in the political drama of that time. He was categorically sure that change was deleterious to the country, and out of devotion to his way of life and the conviction that he was right, he vowed to fight what he thought to be a political evil. But the tide of the time was too strong, it overpowered him. He struggled for 10 years against it in the political arena and in the realm of his personal life. Then the Second World War sealed his efforts into total defeat. His political and ideological downfall resulted in a profound bitterness. He became a self-exile for 25 years. When I met him, he was 84 years old and had come back to his hometown to spend his last years in a home for the aged. It seemed inconceivable to me that he had lived that long, considering the way he had squandered his life in bitterness and self-pity. Somehow he found my company amenable, and we used to talk at great length. The last time I saw him, he had concluded our conversation with the following: "I have had time to turn around and examine my life. The issues of my time are today only a story, not even an interesting one. Perhaps I threw away years of my life chasing something that never existed. I've had the feeling lately that I believed in something farcical. It wasn't worth my while. I think I know that. However, I can't retrieve the 40 years I've lost." I told Don Juan that my conflict arose from the doubts into which his words about controlled folly had thrown me. "If nothing really matters," I said, "upon becoming a man of knowledge one would find oneself, perforce, as empty as my friend and in no better position." "That's not so," Don Juan said cuttingly. "Your friend is lonely because he will die without seeing. In his life he just grew old, and now he must have more self-pity than ever before. He feels he threw away 40 years because he was after victories and found only defeats. He'll never know that to be victorious and to be defeated are equal. So now you're afraid of me because I've told you that you're equal to everything else. You're being childish. Our lot as men is to learn, and one goes to knowledge as one goes to war. I have told you this countless times. One goes to knowledge or to war with fear, with respect, aware that one is going to war, and with absolute confidence in oneself. Put your trust in yourself, not in me. And so you're afraid of the emptiness of your friend's life. But there's no emptiness in the life of a man of knowledge, I tell you. Everything is filled to the brim." Don Juan stood up and extended his arms as if feeling things in the air. "Everything is filled to the brim," he repeated, "and everything is equal. I'm not like your friend who just grew old. When I tell you that nothing matters, I don't mean it the way he does. For him, his struggle was not worth his while because he was defeated. For me there is no victory, or defeat, or emptiness. Everything is filled to the brim and everything is equal, and my struggle was worth my while. In order to become a man of knowledge one must be a warrior, not a whimpering child. One must strive without giving up, without a complaint, without flinching, until one sees, only to realize then that nothing matters." Don Juan stirred the pot with a wooden spoon. The food was ready. He took the pot off the fire and placed it on an adobe rectangular block, which he had built against a wall, and which he used as a shelf for a table. With his foot he shoved two small boxes that served as comfortable chairs, especially if one sat with his back against the supporting beams of the wall. He signaled me to sit down, and then he poured a bowl of soup. He smiled. His eyes were shining as if he were truly enjoying my presence. He pushed the bowl gently toward me. There was such a warmth and kindness in his gesture that it seemed to be an appeal to restore my trust in him. I felt idiotic. I tried to disrupt my mood by looking for my spoon, but I couldn't find it. The soup was too hot to be drunk directly from the bowl, and while it cooled off I asked Don Juan if controlled folly meant that a man of knowledge could not like anybody anymore. He stopped eating and laughed. "You're too concerned with liking people or with being liked yourself," he said. "A man of knowledge likes, that's all. He likes whatever or whoever he wants, but he uses his controlled folly to be unconcerned about it. The opposite of what you are doing now. To like people or to be liked by people is not all one can do as a man." He stared at me for a moment with his head tilted a little to one side. "Think about that," he said. "There is one more thing I want to ask, Don Juan. You said that we need to look with our eyes to laugh, but I believe we laugh because we think. Take a blind man, he also laughs." "No," he said. "Blind men don't laugh. Their bodies jerk a little with the ripple of laughter. They have never looked at the funny edge of the world and have to imagine it. Their laughter is not roaring." We did not speak anymore. I had a sensation of well-being, of happiness. We ate in silence, then Don Juan began to laugh. I was using a dry twig to spoon the vegetables into my mouth. October 4, 1968. At a certain moment today I asked Don Juan if he minded talking a bit more about seeing. He seemed to deliberate for an instant, then he smiled and said that I was again involved in my usual routine, trying to talk instead of doing. "If you want to see, you have to let the smoke guide you," he said emphatically. "I won't talk about this anymore." I was helping him clean some dry herbs. We worked in complete silence for a long time. When I am forced into a prolonged silence, I always feel apprehensive, especially around Don Juan. At a given moment I brought up a question to him in a sort of compulsive, almost belligerent outburst. "How does a man of knowledge exercise controlled folly when it comes to the death of a person he loves?" I asked. Don Juan was taken aback by my question and looked at me quizzically. "Take your grandson Lucio," I said. "Would your acts be controlled folly at the time of his death?" "Take my son Eulalio, that's a better example," Don Juan replied calmly. "He was crushed by rocks while working in the construction of the Pan American Highway. My acts toward him at the moment of his death were controlled folly. When I came down to the blasting area, he was almost dead, but his body was so strong that it kept on moving and kicking. I stood in front of him and told the boys in the road crew not to move him anymore. They obeyed me and stood there surrounding my son, looking at his mangled body. I stood there too, but I did not look. I shifted my eyes so I would see his personal life disintegrating, expanding uncontrollably beyond its limits, like a fog of crystals, because that is the way life and death mix and expand. That is what I did at the time of my son's death. That's all one could ever do, and that is controlled folly. Had I looked at him, I would have watched him becoming immobile, and I would have felt a cry inside of me, because never again would I look at his fine figure pacing the earth. I saw his death instead, and there was no sadness, no feeling. His death was equal to everything else. Don Juan was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be sad, but then he smiled and tapped my head. So you may say that when it comes to the death of a person I love, my controlled folly is to shift my eyes. I thought about the people I love myself, and a terribly oppressive wave of self-pity enveloped me. Lucky you, Don Juan, I said. You can shift your eyes, while I can only look. He found my statement funny and laughed. Lucky, bull, he said. It's hard work. We both laughed. After a long silence, I began probing him again, perhaps only to dispel my own sadness. If I have understood you correctly then, Don Juan, I said, the only acts in the life of a man of knowledge which are not controlled folly are those he performs with his ally or with Mescalito. Isn't that right? That's right, he said, chuckling. My ally and Mescalito are not on a par with us human beings. My controlled folly applies only to myself and to the acts I perform while in the company of my fellow men. However, it is a logical possibility, I said, to think that a man of knowledge may also regard his acts with his ally or with Mescalito as controlled folly. True. He stared at me for a moment. You're thinking again, he said. A man of knowledge doesn't think, therefore he cannot encounter that possibility. Take me, for example. I say that my controlled folly applies to the acts I perform while in the company of my fellow men. I say that because I can see my fellow men. However, I cannot see through my ally, and that makes it incomprehensible to me. So how could I control my folly if I don't see through it? With my ally or with Mescalito, I am only a man who knows how to see and finds that he's baffled by what he sees, a man who knows that he'll never understand all that is around him. Take your case, for instance. It doesn't matter to me whether you become a man of knowledge or not, however, it matters to Mescalito. Obviously it matters to him, or he wouldn't take so many steps to show his concern about you. I can notice his concern and I act toward it, yet his reasons are incomprehensible to me. Just as we were getting into my car to start on a trip to central Mexico, on October 5, 1968, Don Juan stopped me. I have told you before, he said with a serious expression, that one should never reveal the name nor the whereabouts of a sorcerer. I believe you understood that you should never reveal my name nor the place where my body is. Now I am going to ask you to do the same with a friend of mine, a friend you will call Genero. We are going to his house, we will spend some time there. I assured Don Juan that I had never betrayed his confidence. I know that, he said without changing his serious expression. Yet I am concerned with your becoming thoughtless. I protested, and Don Juan said his aim was only to remind me that every time one was careless in matters of sorcery, one was playing with an imminent and senseless death that could be averted by being thoughtful and aware. We will not touch upon this matter any longer, he said. Once we leave my house we will not mention Genero, nor will we think about him. I want you to put your thoughts in order now. When you meet him you must be clear and have no doubts in your mind. What kinds of doubts are you referring to, Don Juan? Any kinds of doubts whatever. When you meet him you ought to be crystal clear. He will see you. His strange admonitions made me very apprehensive. I mentioned that perhaps I should not meet his friend at all, but only drive to the vicinity of his friend's house and leave him there. What I've told you was only a precaution, he said. You've met one sorcerer already, Vicente, and he nearly killed you. Watch out this time. After we arrived in central Mexico, it took us 2 days to walk from where I left my car to his friend's house, a little shack perched on the side of a mountain. Don Juan's friend was at the door, as if he had been waiting for us. I recognized him immediately. I had already made his acquaintance, although very briefly, when I brought my book to Don Juan. I had not really looked at him at that time, except in a glancing fashion, so I had had the feeling he was as old as Don Juan. As he stood at the door of his house, however, I noticed that he was definitely younger. He was perhaps in his early 60s. He was shorter than Don Juan and slimmer, very dark and wiry. His hair was thick and graying and a bit long. It ran over his ears and forehead. His face was round and hard. A very prominent nose made him look like a bird of prey with small dark eyes. He talked to Don Juan first. Don Juan nodded affirmatively. They conversed briefly. They were not speaking Spanish, so I did not understand what they were saying. Then Don Genero turned to me. "You're welcome to my humble little shack," he said apologetically in Spanish. His words were a polite formula I had heard before in various rural areas of Mexico. Yet as he said the words he laughed joyously for no overt reason, and I knew he was exercising his controlled folly. He did not care in the least that his house was a shack. I liked Don Genero very much. For the next 2 days we went into the mountains to collect plants. Don Juan, Don Genero, and I left each day at the crack of dawn. The two old men went together to some specific but unidentified part of the mountains and left me alone in one area of the woods. I had an exquisite feeling there. I did not notice the passage of time, nor was I apprehensive at staying alone. The extraordinary experience I had both days was an uncanny capacity to concentrate on the delicate task of finding the specific plants Don Juan had entrusted me to collect. We returned to the house in the late afternoon, and both days I was so tired that I fell asleep immediately. The third day, however, was different. The three of us worked together, and Don Juan asked Don Genero to teach me how to select certain plants. We returned around noon, and the two old men sat for hours in front of the house, in complete silence, as if they were in a state of trance. Yet they were not asleep. I walked around them a couple of times. Don Juan followed my movements with his eyes, and so did Don Genero. "You must talk to the plants before you pick them," Don Juan said. He dropped his words casually and repeated his statement 3 times, as if to catch my attention. Nobody had said a word until he spoke. "In order to see the plants you must talk to them personally," he went on. "You must get to know them individually, then the plants can tell you anything you care to know about them." It was late in the afternoon. Don Juan was sitting on a flat rock facing the western mountains. Don Genero was sitting by him on a straw mat with his face toward the north. Don Juan had told me, the first day we were there, that those were their positions, and that I had to sit on the ground at any place opposite to both of them. He added that while we sat in those positions I had to keep my face toward the southeast and look at them only in brief glances. "Yes, that's the way it is with plants, isn't it?" Don Juan said and turned to Don Genero, who agreed with an affirmative gesture. I told him that the reason I had not followed his instructions was because I felt a little stupid talking to plants. "You fail to understand that a sorcerer is not joking," he said severely. "When a sorcerer attempts to see, he attempts to gain power. Don Genero was staring at me. I was taking notes and that seemed to baffle him. He smiled at me, shook his head, and said something to Don Juan. Don Juan shrugged his shoulders. To see me writing must have been quite odd for Don Genero. Don Juan was, I suppose, habituated to my taking notes, and the fact that I wrote while he spoke was no longer odd to him. He could carry on talking without appearing to notice my acts. Don Genero, however, kept on laughing, and I had to stop writing in order not to disrupt the mood of the conversation. Don Juan affirmed again that a sorcerer's acts were not to be taken as jokes, because a sorcerer played with death at every turn of the way. Then he proceeded to relate to Don Genero the story of how one night I had looked at the lights of death following me during one of our trips. The story proved to be utterly funny. Don Genero rolled on the ground laughing. Don Juan apologized to me and said that his friend was given to explosions of laughter. I glanced at Don Genero, who I thought was still rolling on the ground, and saw him performing a most unusual act. He was standing on his head without the aid of his arms or hands, and his legs were crossed as if he were sitting. The sight was so incongruous that it made me jump. When I realized he was doing something almost impossible, from the point of view of body mechanics, he had gone back again to a normal sitting position. Don Juan, however, seemed to be cognizant of what was involved and celebrated Don Genero's performance with roaring laughter. Don Genero seemed to have noticed my confusion. He clapped his hands a couple of times and rolled on the ground again. Apparently he wanted me to watch him. What had at first appeared to be rolling on the ground was actually leaning over in a sitting position and touching the ground with his head. He seemingly attained his illogical posture by gaining momentum, leaning over several times until the inertia carried his body to a vertical stand, so that for an instant he sat on his head. When their laughter subsided, Don Juan continued talking. His tone was very severe. I shifted the position of my body in order to be at ease and give him all my attention. He did not smile at all, as he usually does, especially when I try to pay deliberate attention to what he is saying. Don Genero kept looking at me as if he were expecting me to start writing again, but I did not take notes anymore. Don Juan's words were a reprimand for not talking to the plants I had collected, as he had always told me to do. He said the plants I had killed could also have killed me. He said he was sure they would, sooner or later, make me get ill. He added that if I became ill as a result of hurting plants, I would, however, slough it off and believe I had only a touch of the flu. The two of them had another moment of mirth. Then Don Juan became serious again and said that if I did not think of my death, my entire life would be only a personal chaos. He looked very stern. What else can a man have except his life and his death? He said to me. At that point I felt it was indispensable to take notes, and I began writing again. Don Genero stared at me and smiled. Then he tilted his head back a little and opened his nostrils. He apparently had remarkable control over the muscles operating his nostrils, because they opened up to perhaps twice their normal size. What was most comical about his clowning was not so much his gestures as his own reactions to them. After he enlarged his nostrils, he tumbled down, laughing, and worked his body again into the same strange, sitting on his head, upside down posture. Don Juan laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. I felt a bit embarrassed and laughed nervously. Genero doesn't like writing, Don Juan said as an explanation. I put my notes away, but Don Genero assured me that it was all right to write, because he did not really mind it. I gathered my notes again and began writing. He repeated the same hilarious motions, and both of them had the same reactions again. Don Juan looked at me, still laughing, and said that his friend was portraying me, that my tendency was to open my nostrils whenever I wrote, and that Don Genero thought that trying to become a sorcerer by taking notes was as absurd as sitting on one's head, and thus he had made up the ludicrous posture of resting the weight of his sitting body on his head. Perhaps you don't think it's funny, Don Juan said, but only Genero can work his way up to sitting on his head, and only you can think of learning to be a sorcerer by writing your way up. They both had another explosion of laughter, and Don Genero repeated his incredible movement. I liked him. There was so much grace and directness in his acts. My apologies, Don Genero, I said, pointing to the writing pad. It's all right, he said and chuckled again. I could not write anymore. They went on talking for a very long time about how plants could actually kill, and how sorcerers used plants in that capacity. Both of them kept staring at me while they talked, as if they expected me to write. Carlos is like a horse that doesn't like to be saddled, Don Juan said. You have to be very slow with him. You scared him and now he won't write. Don Genero expanded his nostrils and said in a mocking plea, frowning and puckering his mouth. Come on, Carlitos, write. Write until your thumb falls off. Don Juan stood up, stretching his arms and arching his back. In spite of his advanced age, his body seemed to be powerful and limber. He went to the bushes at the side of the house, and I was left alone with Don Genero. He looked at me and I moved my eyes away because he made me feel embarrassed. Don't tell me you're not even going to look at me? He said with a most hilarious intonation. He opened his nostrils and made them quiver, then he stood up and repeated Don Juan's movements, arching his back and stretching his arms, but with his body contorted into a most ludicrous position. It was truly an indescribable gesture that combined an exquisite sense of pantomime and a sense of the ridiculous. It enthralled me. It was a masterful caricature of Don Juan. Don Juan came back at that moment and caught the gesture and obviously the meaning also. He sat down chuckling. Which direction is the wind? Don Genero asked casually. Don Juan pointed to the west with a movement of his head. I'd better go where the wind blows, Don Genero said with a serious expression. He then turned and shook his finger at me. And don't you pay any attention if you hear strange noises, he said. When Genero shits, the mountains tremble. He leaped into the bushes and a moment later I heard a very strange noise, a deep unearthly rumble. I did not know what to make of it. I looked at Don Juan for a clue, but he was doubled over with laughter. October 17, 1968. I don't remember what prompted Don Genero to tell me about the arrangement of the other world, as he called it. He said that a master sorcerer was an eagle, or rather that he could make himself into an eagle. On the other hand, an evil sorcerer was a techelet, an owl. Don Genero said that an evil sorcerer was a child of the night, and for such a man, the most useful animals were the mountain lion or other wild cats, or the night birds, especially the owl. He said that the brujos lyricos, lyric sorcerers, meaning the dilettante sorcerers, preferred other animals, a crow, for example. Don Juan laughed. He had been listening in silence. Don Genero turned to him and said, "That's true, you know that, Juan." Then he said that a master sorcerer could take his disciple on a journey with him and actually pass through the 10 layers of the other world. The master, provided that he was an eagle, could start at the very bottom layer and then go through each successive world until he reached the top. Evil sorcerers and dilettantes could at best, he said, go through only 3 layers. Don Genero gave a description of what those steps were by saying, "You start at the very bottom, and then your teacher takes you with him in his flight and soon, boom, you go through the first layer. Then a little while later, boom, you go through the second, and boom, you go through the third." Don Genero took me through 10 booms to the last layer of the world. When he had finished talking, Don Juan looked at me and smiled knowingly. "Talking is not Genero's predilection," he said, "but if you care to get a lesson, he will teach you about the equilibrium of things." Don Genero nodded affirmatively. He puckered up his mouth and closed his eyelids halfway. I thought his gesture was delightful. Don Genero stood up and so did Don Juan. "All right," Don Genero said. "Let's go, then. We could go and wait for Nestor and Pablito. They're through now. On Thursdays they're through early." Both of them got into my car. Don Juan sat in the front. I did not ask them anything but simply started the engine. Don Juan directed me to a place he said was Nestor's home. Don Genero went into the house and a while later came out with Nestor and Pablito, 2 young men who were his apprentices. They all got in my car and Don Juan told me to take the road toward the western mountains. We left my car on the side of the dirt road and walked along the bank of a river, which was perhaps 15 or 20 feet across, to a waterfall that was visible from where I had parked. It was late afternoon. The scenery was quite impressive. Directly above us there was a huge dark bluish cloud that looked like a floating roof. It had a well-defined edge and was shaped like an enormous half-circle. To the west, on the high mountains of the Cordillera Central, the rain seemed to be descending on the slopes. It looked like a whitish curtain falling on the green peaks. To the east there was the long, deep valley. There were only scattered clouds over the valley, and the sun was shining there. The contrast between the 2 areas was magnificent. We stopped at the bottom of the waterfall. It was perhaps 150 feet high. The roar was very loud. Don Genero fastened a belt around his waist. He had at least 7 items hanging from it. They looked like small gourds. He took off his hat and let it hang on his back from a cord tied around his neck. He put on a headband that he took from a pouch made of a thick wool fabric. The headband was also made of wool of various colors. A sharp yellow was the most prominent of them. He inserted 3 feathers in the headband. They seemed to be eagle feathers. I noticed that the places where he had inserted them were not symmetrical. One feather was above the back curve of his right ear, the other was a few inches to the front, and the third was over his left temple. Then he took off his sandals, hooked or tied them to the waist of his trousers, and fastened his belt over his poncho. The belt seemed to be made of woven strips of leather. I could not see whether he tied it or buckled it. Don Genero walked toward the waterfall. Don Juan manipulated a round rock into a steady position and sat down on it. The other 2 young men did the same with some rocks and sat down to his left. Don Juan pointed to the place next to him, on his right side, and told me to bring a rock and sit by him. "We must make a line here," he said, showing me that the three were sitting in a row. By then Don Genero had reached the very bottom of the waterfall and had begun climbing a trail on the right side of it. From where we were sitting, the trail looked fairly steep. There were a lot of shrubs he used as railings. At one moment he seemed to lose his footing and almost slid down, as if the dirt were slippery. A moment later the same thing happened, and the thought crossed my mind that perhaps Don Genero was too old to be climbing. I saw him slipping and stumbling several times before he reached the spot where the trail ended. I experienced a sort of apprehension when he began to climb the rocks. I could not figure out what he was going to do. "What's he doing?" I asked Don Juan in a whisper. Don Juan did not look at me. "Obviously he's climbing," he said. Don Juan was looking straight at Don Genero. His gaze was fixed. His eyelids were half closed. He was sitting very erect with his hands resting between his legs on the edge of the rock. I leaned over a little bit to see the two young men. Don Juan made an imperative gesture with his hand to make me get back in line. I retreated immediately. I had only a glimpse of the young men. They seemed to be as attentive as he was. Don Juan made another gesture with his hand and pointed to the direction of the waterfall. I looked again. Don Genero had climbed quite a way on the rocky wall. At the moment I looked, he was perched on a ledge, inching his way slowly to circumvent a huge boulder. His arms were spread, as if he were embracing the rock. He moved slowly toward his right, and suddenly he lost his footing. I gasped involuntarily. For a moment his whole body hung in the air. I was sure he was going to fall, but he did not. His right hand had grabbed onto something, and very agilely his feet went back on the ledge again. But before he moved on, he turned to us and looked. It was only a glance. There was, however, such a stylization to the movement of turning his head that I began to wonder. I remembered then that he had done the same thing, turning to look at us every time he slipped. I had thought that Don Genero must have felt embarrassed by his clumsiness and turned to see if we were looking. He climbed a bit more toward the top, suffered another loss of footing, and hung perilously on the overhanging rock face. This time he was supported by his left hand. When he regained his balance, he turned and looked at us again. He slipped twice more before he reached the top. From where we were sitting, the crest of the waterfall seemed to be 20 to 25 feet across. Don Genero stood motionless for a moment. I wanted to ask Don Juan what Don Genero was going to do up there, but Don Juan seemed to be so absorbed in watching that I did not dare disturb him. Suddenly Don Genero jumped onto the water. It was such a thoroughly unexpected action that I felt a vacuum in the pit of my stomach. It was a magnificent, outlandish leap. For a second I had the clear sensation that I had seen a series of superimposed images of his body, making an elliptical flight to the middle of the stream. When my surprise receded, I noticed that he had landed on a rock on the edge of the fall, a rock which was hardly visible from where we were sitting. He stayed perched there for a long time. He seemed to be fighting the power of the onrushing water. Twice he hung over the precipice, and I could not determine what he was clinging to. He gained his balance and squatted on the rock. Then he leaped again, like a tiger. I could barely see the next rock where he landed. It was like a small cone on the very edge of Tyne Fall. He remained there almost 10 minutes. He was motionless. His immobility was so impressive to me that I was shivering. I wanted to get up and walk around. Don Juan noticed my nervousness and told me imperatively to be calm. Don Genero's stillness plunged me into an extraordinary and mysterious terror. I felt that if he remained perched there any longer I could not control myself. Suddenly he jumped again, this time all the way to the other bank of the waterfall. He landed on his feet and hands, like a feline. He remained in a squat position for a moment, then he stood up and looked across the fall, to the other side, and then down at us. He stayed dead still looking at us. His hands were clasped at his sides, as if he were holding onto an unseen railing. There was something truly exquisite about his posture. His body seemed so nimble, so frail. I thought that Don Genero with his headband and feathers, his dark poncho and his bare feet, was the most beautiful human being I had ever seen. He threw his arms up suddenly, lifted his head, and flipped his body swiftly in a sort of lateral somersault to his left. The boulder where he had been standing was round, and when he jumped he disappeared behind it. Huge drops of rain began to fall at that moment. Don Juan got up and so did the two young men. Their movement was so abrupt that it confused me. Don Genero's masterful feat had thrown me into a state of profound emotional excitement. I felt he was a consummate artist, and I wanted to see him right then to applaud him. I strained to look on the left side of the waterfall to see if he was coming down, but he was not. I insisted on knowing what had happened to him. Don Juan did not answer. "We'd better hurry out of here," he said. "It's a real downpour. We have to take Nestor and Pablito to their house, and then we'll have to start on our trip back." I didn't even say goodbye to Don Genero, I complained. "He already said goodbye to you," Don Juan answered harshly. He peered at me for an instant and then softened his frown and smiled. "He has also wished you well," he said. "He felt happy with you. But aren't we going to wait for him?" "No," Don Juan said sharply, "let him be, wherever he is. Perhaps he is an eagle flying to the other world, or perhaps he has died up there. It doesn't matter now." October 23, 1968. Don Juan casually mentioned that he was going to make another trip to central Mexico in the near future. "Are you going to visit Don Genero?" I asked. "Perhaps," he said without looking at me. "He's all right, isn't he, Don Juan? I mean, nothing bad happened to him up there on top of the waterfall, did it?" "Nothing happened to him. He is sturdy." We talked about his projected trip for a while, and then I said I had enjoyed Don Genero's company and his jokes. He laughed and said that Don Genero was truly like a child. There was a long pause. I struggled in my mind to find an opening line to ask about his lesson. Don Juan looked at me and said in a mischievous tone, "You're dying to ask me about Genero's lesson, aren't you?" I laughed with embarrassment. I had been obsessed with everything that took place at the waterfall. I had been hashing and rehashing all the details I could remember, and my conclusions were that I had witnessed an incredible feat of physical prowess. I thought Don Genero was beyond doubt a peerless master of equilibrium. Every single movement he had performed was highly ritualized and, needless to say, must have had some inextricable, symbolic meaning. "Yes," I said. "I admit I'm dying to know what his lesson was." "Let me tell you something," Don Juan said. "It was a waste of time for you. His lesson was for someone who can see." Pablito and Nestor got the gist of it, although they don't see very well. But you went there to look. I told Genero that you are a very strange plugged-up fool, and that perhaps you'd get unplugged with his lesson, but you didn't. It doesn't matter, though. Seeing is very difficult. I didn't want you to speak to Genero afterwards, so we had to leave. Too bad. Yet it would have been worse to stay. Genero risked a great deal to show you something magnificent. Too bad you can't see. Perhaps, Don Juan, if you tell me what the lesson was, I may find out that I really saw. Don Juan doubled up with laughter. Your best feature is asking questions, he said. He was apparently going to drop the subject again. We were sitting, as usual, in the area in front of his house. He suddenly got up and walked inside. I trailed behind him and insisted on describing to him what I had seen. I faithfully followed the sequence of events as I remembered it. Don Juan kept on smiling while I spoke. When I had finished, he shook his head. Seeing is very difficult, he said. I begged him to explain his statement. Seeing is not a matter of talk, he said imperatively. Obviously he was not going to tell me anything more, so I gave up and left the house to run some errands for him. When I returned it was already dark. We had something to eat, and afterwards we walked out to the Ramada. We had no sooner sat down than Don Juan began to talk about Don Genero's lesson. He did not give me any time to prepare myself for it. I did have my notes with me, but it was too dark to write, and I did not want to alter the flow of his talk by going inside the house for the kerosene lantern. He said that Don Genero, being a master of balance, could perform very complex and difficult movements. Sitting on his head was one of such movements, and with it he had attempted to show me that it was impossible to see while I took notes. The action of sitting on his head without the aid of his hands was, at best, a freakish stunt that lasted only an instant. In Don Genero's opinion, writing about seeing was the same, that is, it was a precarious maneuver, as odd and as unnecessary as sitting on one's head. Don Juan peered at me in the dark and in a very dramatic tone said that while Don Genero was horsing around, sitting on his head, I was on the very verge of seeing. Don Genero noticed it and repeated his maneuvers over and over, to no avail, because I had lost the thread right away. Don Juan said that afterwards Don Genero, moved by his personal liking for me, attempted in a very dramatic way to bring me back to that verge of seeing. After very careful deliberation, he decided to show me a feat of equilibrium by crossing the waterfall. He felt that the waterfall was like the edge on which I was standing, and was confident I could also make it across. Don Juan then explained Don Genero's feat. He said that he had already told me that human beings were, for those who saw, luminous beings composed of something like fibers of light, which rotated from the front to the back and maintained the appearance of an egg. He said that he had also told me that the most astonishing part of the egg-like creatures was a set of long fibers that came out of the area around the navel. Don Juan said that those fibers were of the uttermost importance in the life of a man. Those fibers were the secret of Don Genero's balance, and his lesson had nothing to do with acrobatic jumps across the waterfall. His feat of equilibrium was in the way he used those tentacle-like fibers. Don Juan dropped the subject as suddenly as he had started it, and began to talk about something thoroughly unrelated. October 24, 1968. I cornered Don Juan and told him I intuitively felt that I was never going to get another lesson in equilibrium, and that he had to explain to me all the pertinent details, which I would otherwise never discover by myself. Don Juan said I was right, insofar as knowing that Don Genero would never give me another lesson. "What else do you want to know?" he asked. "What are those tentacle-like fibers, Don Juan?" "They are the tentacles that come out of a man's body which are apparent to any sorcerer who sees. Sorcerers act toward people in accordance to the way they see their tentacles. Weak persons have very short, almost invisible fibers. Strong persons have bright, long ones. Generos, for instance, are so bright that they resemble thickness. You can tell from the fibers if a person is healthy, or if he is sick, or if he is mean, or kind, or treasonous. You can also tell from the fibers if a person can see. Here is a baffling problem. When Genero saw you, he knew, just like my friend Vicente did, that you could see. When I see you, I see that you can see, and yet I know myself that you can't. How baffling. Genero couldn't get over that. I told him that you were a strange fool. I think he wanted to see that for himself and took you to the waterfall. Why do you think I give the impression I can see?" Don Juan did not answer me. He remained silent for a long time. I did not want to ask him anything else. Finally he spoke to me and said that he knew why, but did not know how to explain it. "You think everything in the world is simple to understand," he said, "because everything you do is a routine that is simple to understand. At the waterfall, when you looked at Genero moving across the water, you believed that he was a master of somersaults, because somersaults was all you could think about. And that is all you will ever believe he did. Yet Genero never jumped across that water. If he had jumped, he would have died. Genero balanced himself on his superb, bright fibers. He made them long enough so that he could, let's say, roll on them across the waterfall. He demonstrated the proper way to make those tentacles long and how to move them with precision. Pablito saw nearly all of Genero's movements. Nestor, on the other hand, saw only the most obvious maneuvers. He missed the delicate details. But you saw nothing at all. Perhaps if you had told me beforehand, Don Juan, what to look for." He interrupted me and said that giving me instructions would only have hindered Don Genero. Had I known what was going to take place, my fibers would have been agitated and would have interfered with Don Genero's. "If you could see," he said, "it would have been obvious to you, from the first step that Genero took, that he was not slipping as he went up the side of the waterfall. He was loosening his tentacles. Twice he made them go around boulders and held to the sheer rock like a fly. When he got to the top and was ready to cross the water, he focused them onto a small rock in the middle of the stream, and when they were secured there, he let the fibers pull him. Genero never jumped, therefore he could land on the slippery surfaces of small boulders at the very edge of the water. His fibers were at all times neatly wrapped around every rock he used. He did not stay on the first boulder very long, because he had the rest of his fibers tied onto another one, even smaller, at the place where the onrush of water was the greatest. His tentacles pulled him again and he landed on it. That was the most outstanding thing he did. The surface was too small for a man to hold onto, and the onrush of the water would have washed his body over the precipice had he not had some of his fibers still focused on the first rock. He stayed in that second position for a long time because he had to draw out his tentacles again and send them across to the other side of the fall. When he had them secured, he had to release the fibers focused on the first rock. That was very tricky. Perhaps only Genero could do that. He nearly lost his grip, or maybe he was only fooling us. We'll never know that for sure. Personally, I really think he nearly lost his grip. I know that because he became rigid and sent out a magnificent shoot, like a beam of light across the water. I feel that beam alone could have pulled him through. When he got to the other side, he stood up and let his fibers glow like a cluster of lights. That was the one thing he did just for you. If you had been able to see, you would have seen that. Genero stood there looking at you, and then he knew that you had not seen. Task of seeing. Don Juan was not at his house when I arrived there at midday on November 8, 1968. I had no idea where to look for him, so I sat and waited. For some unknown reason, I knew he would soon be home. A short while later, Don Juan walked into his house. He nodded at me. We exchanged greetings. He seemed to be tired and lay down on his mat. He yawned a couple of times. The idea of seeing had become an obsession with me, and I had made up my mind to use his hallucinogenic smoking mixture again. It had been a terribly difficult decision to make, so I still wanted to argue the point a bit further. I want to learn to see, Don Juan, I said bluntly. But I really don't want to take anything. I don't want to smoke your mixture. Do you think there is any chance I could learn to see without it? He sat up, stared at me for a moment, and lay down again. No, he said. You will have to use the smoke. But you said I was on the verge of seeing with Don Genero. I meant that something in you was glowing, as though you were really aware of Genero's doings, but you were just looking. Obviously there is something in you that resembles seeing, but isn't. You're plugged up and only the smoke can help you. Why does one have to smoke? Why can't one simply learn to see by oneself? I have a very earnest desire. Isn't that enough? No, it's not enough. Seeing is not so simple, and only the smoke can give you the speed you need to catch a glimpse of that fleeting world. Otherwise you will only look. What do you mean by a fleeting world? The world, when you see, is not as you think it is now. It's rather a fleeting world that moves and changes. One may perhaps learn to apprehend that fleeting world by oneself, but it won't do any good, because the body decays with the stress. With the smoke, on the other hand, one never suffers from exhaustion. The smoke gives the necessary speed to grasp the fleeting movement of the world, and at the same time it keeps the body and its strength intact. All right, I said dramatically. I don't want to beat around the bush any longer. I'll smoke. He laughed at my display of histrionics. Cut it out, he said. You always hook onto the wrong thing. Now you think that just deciding to let the smoke guide you is going to make you see. There's much more to it. There is always much more to anything. He became serious for a moment. I have been very careful with you, and my acts have been deliberate, he said, because it is Mescalito's desire that you understand my knowledge. But I know that I won't have time to teach you all I want. I will only have time to put you on the road and trust that you will seek in the same fashion I did. I must admit that you are more indolent and more stubborn than I. You have other views, though, and the direction that your life will take is something I cannot foresee. His deliberate tone of voice, something in his attitude, summoned up an old feeling in me, a mixture of fear, loneliness, and expectation. "We'll soon know where you stand," he said cryptically. He did not say anything else. After a while he went outside the house. I followed him and stood in front of him, not knowing whether to sit down or to unload some packages I had brought for him. "Would it be dangerous?" I asked, just to say something. "Everything is dangerous," he said. Don Juan did not seem to be inclined to tell me anything else. He gathered some small bundles that were piled in a corner and put them inside a carrying net. I did not offer to help him because I knew that if he had wished my help he would have asked me. Then he lay down on his straw mat. He told me to relax and rest. I lay down on my mat and tried to sleep, but I was not tired. The night before I had stopped at a motel and slept until noon, knowing that I had only a 3-hour drive to Don Juan's place. He was not sleeping either. Although his eyes were closed. "Let's eat something," Don Juan said suddenly, and his voice made me jump. "You're going to need all your energy. You should be in good shape." He made some soup, but I wasn't hungry. The next day, November 9, Don Juan let me eat only a morsel of food and told me to rest. I lay around all morning, but I could not relax. I had no idea what Don Juan had in mind, but, worst of all, I was not certain what I had in mind myself. We were sitting under his ramada around 3 p.m. I was very hungry. I had suggested various times that we should eat, but he had refused. "You haven't prepared your mixture for 3 years," he said suddenly. "You'll have to smoke my mixture, so let's say that I have collected it for you. You will need only a bit of it. I will fill the pipe's bowl once. You will smoke all of it and then rest. Then the keeper of the other world will come. You will do nothing but observe it. Observe how it moves, observe everything it does. Your life may depend on how." I could not organize my thoughts. Finally I asked the first clear thing that came to my mind. "Who's this guardian?" Don Juan flatly refused to involve himself in conversation, but I was too nervous to stop talking, and I insisted desperately that he tell me about this guardian. "You'll see it," he said casually. "It guards the other world." "What world?" "The world of the dead." "It's not the world of the dead or the world of anything. It's just another world. There's no use telling you about it. See it for yourself." With that Don Juan went inside the house. I followed him into his room. Wait, Don Juan. What are you going to do?" He did not answer. He took his pipe out of a bundle and sat down on a straw mat in the center of the room, looking at me inquisitively. He seemed to be waiting for my consent. "You're a fool," he said softly. "You're not afraid. You just say you're afraid." He shook his head slowly from "I am really afraid. No, it's not fear." I desperately tried to gain time and began a long discussion about the nature of my feelings. I sincerely maintained that I was afraid, but he pointed out that I was not panting, nor was my heart beating faster than usual. I thought for a while about what he had said. He was wrong. I did have many of the physical changes ordinarily associated with fear, and I was desperate. A sense of impending doom permeated everything around me. My stomach was upset and I was sure I was pale. My hands were sweating profusely, and yet I really thought I was not afraid. I did not have the feeling of fear I had been accustomed to throughout my life. The fear which has always been idiosyncratically mine was not there. I was talking as I paced up and down the room in front of Don Juan, who was still sitting on his mat, holding his pipe, and looking at me inquisitively. And upon considering the matter, I arrived at the conclusion that what I felt instead of my usual fear was a profound sense of displeasure, a discomfort at the mere thought of the confusion created by the intake of hallucinogenic plants. Don Juan stared at me for an instant, then he looked past me, squinting as if he were struggling to detect something in the distance. I kept walking back and forth in front of him until he forcefully told me to sit down and relax. We sat quietly for a few minutes. "You don't want to lose your clarity, do you?" he said abruptly. "That's very right, Don Juan," I said. He laughed with apparent delight. "Clarity, the second enemy of a man of knowledge, has loomed upon you. You're not afraid," he said reassuringly, "but now you hate to lose your clarity, and since you're a fool, you call that fear." He chuckled. "Get me some charcoals," he ordered. His tone was kind and reassuring. I got up automatically and went to the back of the house and gathered some small pieces of burning charcoal from the fire, put them on top of a small stone slab, and returned to the room. "Come out here to the porch," Don Juan called loudly from outside. He placed a straw mat on the spot where I usually sit. I put the charcoals next to him and he blew on them to activate the fire. I was about to sit down, but he stopped me and told me to sit on the right edge of the mat. He then put a piece of charcoal in the pipe and handed it to me. I took it. I was amazed at the silent forcefulness with which Don Juan had steered me. I could not think of anything to say. I had no more arguments. I was convinced that I was not afraid, but only unwilling to lose my clarity. "Puff, puff," he ordered me gently. "Just one bowl this time." I sucked on the pipe and heard the chirping of the mixture catching on fire. I felt an instantaneous coat of ice inside my mouth and my nose. I took another puff and the coating extended to my chest. When I had taken the last puff, I felt that the entire inside of my body was coated with a peculiar sensation of cold warmth. Don Juan took the pipe away from me and tapped the bowl on his palm to loosen the residue. Then, as he always does, he wet his finger with saliva and rubbed it inside the bowl. My body was numb, but I could move. I changed positions to sit more comfortably. "What's going to happen?" I asked. I had some difficulty vocalizing. Don Juan very carefully put his pipe inside its sheath and rolled it up in a long piece of cloth. Then he sat up straight, facing me. I felt dizzy, my eyes were closing involuntarily. Don Juan shook me vigorously and ordered me to stay awake. He said I knew very well that if I fell asleep I would die. That jolted me. It occurred to me that Don Juan was probably just saying that to keep me awake, but on the other hand, it also occurred to me that he might be right. I opened my eyes as wide as I could, and that made Don Juan laugh. He said that I had to wait for a while and keep my eyes open all the time, and that at a given moment, I would be able to see the guardian of the other world. I felt a very annoying heat all over my body. I tried to change positions, but I could not move anymore. I wanted to talk to Don Juan. The words seemed to be so deep inside of me that I could not bring them out. Then I tumbled on my left side and found myself looking at Don Juan from the floor. He leaned over and ordered me in a whisper not to look at him, but to stare fixedly at a point on my mat which was directly in front of my eyes. He said that I had to look with one eye, my left eye, and that sooner or later I would see the guardian. I fixed my stare on the spot he had pointed to, but I did not see anything. At a certain moment, however, I noticed a gnat flying in front of my eyes. It landed on the mat. I followed its movements. It came very close to me, so close that my visual perception blurred. And then, all of a sudden, I felt as if I had stood up. It was a very puzzling sensation that deserved some pondering, but there was no time for that. I had the total sensation that I was looking straight onward from my usual eye level, and what I saw shook up the last fiber of my being. There is no other way to describe the emotional jolt I experienced. Right there facing me, a short distance away, was a gigantic monstrous animal. A truly monstrous thing. Never in the wildest fantasies of fiction had I encountered anything like it. I looked at it in complete, utmost bewilderment. The first thing I really noticed was its size. I thought, for some reason, that it must be close to 100 feet tall. It seemed to be standing erect, although I could not figure out how it stood. Next, I noticed that it had wings, two short, wide wings. At that point I became aware that I insisted on examining the animal as if it were an ordinary sight, that is, I looked at it. However, I could not really look at it in the way I was accustomed to looking. I realized that I was, rather, noticing things about it, as if the picture were becoming more clear as parts were added. Its body was covered with tufts of black hair. It had a long muzzle and was drooling. Its eyes were bulgy and round, like two enormous white balls. Then it began to beat its wings. It was not the flapping motion of a bird's wings, but a kind of flickering, vibratory tremor. It gained speed and began circling in front of me. It was not flying, but rather skidding with astounding speed and agility, just a few inches above the ground. For a moment I found myself engrossed in watching it move. I thought that its movements were ugly, and yet its speed and easiness were superb. It circled twice in front of me, vibrating its wings, and whatever was drooling out of its mouth flew in all directions. Then it turned around and skidded away at an incredible speed until it disappeared in the distance. I stared fixedly in the direction it had gone because there was nothing else I could do. I had a most peculiar sensation of being incapable of organizing my thoughts coherently. I could not move away. It was as if I were glued to the spot. Then I saw something like a cloud in the distance. An instant later the gigantic beast was circling again at full speed in front of me. Its wings cut closer and closer to my eyes until they hit me. I felt that its wings had actually hit whatever part of me was there. I yelled with all my might in the midst of one of the most excruciating pains I have ever had. The next thing I knew I was seated on my mat and Don Juan was rubbing my forehead. He rubbed my arms and legs with leaves, then he took me to an irrigation ditch behind his house, took off my clothes, and submerged me completely, then pulled me out and submerged me over and over again. As I lay on the shallow bottom of the irrigation ditch, Don Juan pulled up my left foot from time to time and tapped the sole gently. After a while I felt a ticklishness. He noticed it and said that I was all right. I put on my clothes and we returned to his house. I sat down again on my straw mat and tried to talk, but I felt I could not concentrate on what I wanted to say, although my thoughts were very clear. I was amazed to realize how much concentration was necessary to talk. I also noticed that in order to say something I had to stop looking at things. I had the impression that I was entangled at a very deep level, and when I wanted to talk I had to surface like a diver. I had to ascend as if pulled by my words. Twice I went as far as clearing my throat in a fashion which was perfectly ordinary. I could have said then whatever I wanted to, but I did not. I preferred to remain at the strange level of silence where I could just look. I had the feeling that I was beginning to tap what Don Juan had called seeing, and that made me very happy. Afterwards Don Juan gave me some soup and tortillas and ordered me to eat. I was able to eat without any trouble and without losing what I thought to be my power of seeing. I focused my gaze on everything around me. I was convinced I could see everything, and yet the world looked the same to the best of my assessment. I struggled to see until it was quite dark. I finally got tired and lay down and went to sleep. I woke up when Don Juan covered me with a blanket. I had a headache and I was sick to my stomach. After a while I felt better and slept soundly until the next day. In the morning I was myself again. I asked Don Juan eagerly, "What happened to me?" Don Juan laughed coyly. "You went to look for the keeper and of course you found it," he said. "But what was it, Don Juan?" "The guardian, the keeper, the sentry of the other world," Don Juan said factually. I intended to relate to him the details of the portentous and ugly beast, but he disregarded my attempt, saying that my experience was nothing special, that any man could do that. I told him that the guardian had been such a shock to me that I really had not yet been able to think about it. Don Juan laughed and made fun of what he called an overdramatic bent of my nature. "That thing, whatever it was, hurt me," I said. "It was as real as you and I." "Of course it was real." "It caused you pain, didn't it?" As I recollected my experience I grew more excited. Don Juan told me to calm down. Then he asked me if I had really been afraid of it. He stressed the word really. "I was petrified," I said. "Never in my life have I experienced such an awesome fright." "Come on," he said, laughing. "You were not that afraid." "I swear to you," I said with genuine fervor, "that if I could have moved I would have run hysterically." He found my statement very funny and roared with laughter. "What was the point of making me see that monstrosity, Don Juan?" He became serious and gazed at me. "That was the guardian," he said. "If you want to see you must overcome the guardian." "But how am I to overcome it, Don Juan?" "It is perhaps 100 feet tall." Don Juan laughed so hard that tears rolled down his cheeks. "Why don't you let me tell you what I saw, so there won't be any misunderstanding?" I said. "If that makes you happy, go ahead, tell me." I narrated everything I could remember, but that did not seem to change his mood. "Still, that's nothing new," he said, smiling. "But how do you expect me to overcome a thing like that?" "With what?" He was silent for quite a while. Then he turned to me and said, "You were not afraid, not really. You were hurt, but you were not afraid." He reclined against some bundles and put his arms behind his head. I thought he had dropped the subject. "You know," he said suddenly, looking at the roof of the Ramada, "every man can see the guardian. And the guardian is sometimes for some of us an awesome beast as high as the sky. You're lucky, for you it was only 100 feet tall. And yet its secret is so simple." He paused for a moment and hummed a Mexican song. "The guardian of the other world is a gnat, he said slowly, as if he were measuring the effect of his words. I beg your pardon. The guardian of the other world is a gnat, he repeated. What you encountered yesterday was a gnat, and that little gnat will keep you away until you overcome it. For a moment I did not want to believe what Don Juan was saying, but upon recollecting the sequence of my vision, I had to admit that at a certain moment I was looking at a gnat, and an instant later a sort of mirage had taken place, and I was looking at the beast. But how could a gnat hurt me, Don Juan? I asked, truly bewildered. It was not a gnat when it hurt you, he said, it was the guardian of the other world. Perhaps someday you will have the courage to overcome it. Not now, though, now it is 100-foot tall drooling beast. But there is no point in talking about it. It's no feat to stand in front of it, so if you want to know more about it, find a guardian again. 2 days later, on November 11th, I smoked Don Juan's mixture again. I had asked Don Juan to let me smoke once more to find the guardian. I had not asked him on the spur of the moment, but after long deliberation. My curiosity about the guardian was disproportionately greater than my fear, or the discomfort of losing my clarity. The procedure was the same. Don Juan filled the pipe bowl once, and when I had finished the entire contents he cleaned it and put it away. The effect was markedly slower. When I began to feel a bit dizzy, Don Juan came to me and, holding my head in his hands, helped me to lie down on my left side. He told me to stretch my legs and relax, and then helped me put my right arm in front of my body, at the level of my chest. He turned my hand so the palm was pressing against a mat, and let my weight rest on it. I did not do anything to help or hinder him, for I did not know what he was doing. He sat in front of me and told me not to be concerned with anything. He said that the guardian was going to come, and that I had a ringside seat to see it. He also told me, in a casual way, that the guardian could cause great pain, but that there was one way to avert it. He said that 2 days before he had made me sit up when he judged I had had enough. He pointed to my right arm and said that he had deliberately put it in that position, so I could use it as a lever to push myself up whenever I wanted to. By the time he had finished telling me all that, my body was quite numb. I wanted to call to his attention the fact that it would be impossible for me to push myself up, because I had lost control of my muscles. I tried to vocalize the words, but I could not. He seemed to have anticipated me, however, and explained that the trick was in the will. He urged me to remember the time, years before, when I had first smoked the mushrooms. On that occasion I had fallen to the ground and sprung up to my feet again by an act of what he called, at that time, my will. I had thought myself up. He said that was in fact the only possible way to get up. What he was saying was useless to me because I did not remember what I had really done years before. I had an overwhelming sense of despair and closed my eyes. Don Juan grabbed me by the hair, shook my head vigorously, and ordered me imperatively not to close my eyes. I not only opened my eyes, but I did something I thought was astonishing. I actually said, "I don't know how I got up that time." I was startled. There was something very monotonous about the rhythm of my voice, but it was plainly my voice, and yet I honestly believed I could not have said that, because a minute before I had been incapable of speaking. I looked at Don Juan. He turned his face to one side and laughed. "I did not say that," I said. And again I was startled by my voice. I felt elated. Speaking under these conditions became an exhilarating process. I wanted to ask Don Juan to explain my talking, but I found I was again incapable of uttering one single word. I struggled fiercely to voice my thoughts, but it was useless. I gave up, and at that moment, almost involuntarily, I said, "Who's talking? Who's talking?" That question made Don Juan laugh so hard that at one point he bobbed on his side. Apparently it was possible for me to say simple things, as long as I knew exactly what I wanted to say. "Am I talking? Am I talking?" I asked. Don Juan told me that if I did not stop horsing around he was going to go out and lie down under the ramada and leave me alone with my clowning. "It isn't clowning," I said. I was very serious about that. My thoughts were very clear. My body, however, was numb. I did not feel it. I was not suffocated, as I had once been in the past under similar conditions. I was comfortable because I could not feel anything. I had no control whatever over my voluntary system, and yet I could talk. The thought occurred to me that if I could talk I could probably stand up as Don Juan had said. "Up," I said in English, and in a flicker of an eye I was up. Don Juan shook his head in disbelief and walked out of the house. "Don Juan." I called out 3 times. He came back. "Put me down," I said. "Put yourself down," he said. "You seem to be doing very well." I said, "Down," and suddenly I lost sight of the room. I could not see anything. After a moment the room and Don Juan came back again into my field of vision. I thought that I must have lain down with my face to the ground, and he had grabbed me by the hair and lifted my head. "Thank you," I said in a very slow monotone. "You are welcome," he replied, mocking my tone of voice, and had another attack of laughter. Then he took some leaves and began rubbing my arms and feet with them. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I am rubbing you," he said, imitating my painful monotone. His body convulsed with laughter. His eyes were shiny and very friendly. I liked him. I felt that Don Juan was compassionate and fair and funny. I could not laugh with him, but I would have liked to. Another feeling of exhilaration invaded me and I laughed. It was such an awful sound that Don Juan was taken aback for an instant. "I'd better take you to the ditch," he said, "or you're going to kill yourself clowning." He put me up on my feet and made me walk around the room. Little by little I began to feel my feet and my legs and finally my entire body. My ears were bursting with a strange pressure. It was like the sensation of a leg or an arm that has fallen asleep. I felt a tremendous weight on the back of my neck and under the scalp on the top of my head. Don Juan rushed me to the irrigation ditch at the back of his house. He dumped me there fully clothed. The cold water reduced the pressure and the pain, by degrees, until it was all gone. I changed my clothes in the house and sat down, and I again felt the same kind of aloofness, the same desire to stay quiet. I noticed this time, however, that it was not clarity of mind or a power to focus, rather, it was a sort of melancholy and a physical fatigue. Finally I fell asleep. November 12, 1968. This morning Don Juan and I went to the nearby hills to collect plants. We walked about 6 miles on extremely rough terrain. I became very tired. We sat down to rest at my initiative, and he began a conversation, saying that he was pleased with my progress. "I know now that it was I who talked," I said, But at the time I could have sworn it was someone else. It was you, of course, he said. How come I couldn't recognize myself? That's what the little smoke does. One can talk and not notice it, or one can move thousands of miles and not notice that either. That's also how one can go through things. The little smoke removes the body, and one is free, like the wind, better than the wind. The wind can be stopped by a rock or a wall or a mountain. The little smoke makes one as free as the air, perhaps even freer. The air can be locked in a tomb and become stale, but with the aid of the little smoke, one cannot be stopped or locked in. Then one can really do all those things, Don Juan? What do you think? You would rather think you're crazy, wouldn't you? He said cuttingly. Well, it's easy for you to accept all those things. For me it's impossible. It's not easy for me. I don't have any more privileges than you. Those things are equally hard for you or for me or for anyone else to accept. But you are at home with all this, Don Juan. Yes, but it cost me plenty. I had to struggle, perhaps more than you ever will. You have a baffling way of getting everything to work for you. You have no idea how hard I had to toil to do what you did yesterday. You have something that helps you every inch of the way. There is no other possible explanation for the manner in which you learn about the powers. You did it before with Mescalito, now you have done it with the little smoke. You should concentrate on the fact that you have a great gift and leave other considerations on the side. You make it sound so easy, but it isn't. I'm torn inside. You'll be in one piece again soon enough. You have not taken care of your body, for one thing. You're too fat. I didn't want to say anything to you before. One must always let others do what they have to do. You were away for years. I told you that you would come back, though, and you did. The same thing happened to me. I quit for 5.5 years. Why did you stay away, Don Juan? For the same reason you did. I didn't like it. Why did you come back? For the same reason you have come back yourself, because there is no other way to live. That statement had a great impact on me, for I had found myself thinking that perhaps there was no other way to live. I had never voiced this thought to anyone, yet Don Juan had surmised it correctly. After a very long silence I asked him, "What did I do yesterday, Don Juan?" "You got up when you wanted to. But I don't know how I did that. It takes tune to perfect that technique. The important thing, however, is that you know how to do it. But I don't. That's the point, I really don't." "Of course you do. Don Juan, I assure you, I swear to you." He did not let me finish. He got up and walked away. Later on we talked again about the guardian of the other world. If I believe that whatever I have experienced is actually real, I said, then the guardian is a gigantic creature that can cause unbelievable physical pain. And if I believe that one can actually travel enormous distances by an act of will, then it's logical to conclude that I could also will the monster to disappear. Is that correct? Not exactly, he said. You cannot will the guardian to disappear. Your will can stop it from harming you, though. Of course, if you ever accomplish that, the road is open to you. You can actually go by the guardian and there's nothing that it can do, not even whirl around madly. How can I accomplish that? You already know how. All you need now is practice. I told him that we were having a misunderstanding that stemmed from our differences in perceiving the world. I said that for me to know something meant that I had to be fully aware of what I was doing, and that I could repeat what I knew at will, but in this case I was neither aware of what I had done under the influence of the smoke, nor could I repeat it if my life depended on it. Don Juan looked at me inquisitively. He seemed to be amused by what I was saying. He took off his hat and scratched his temples as he does when he wants to pretend bewilderment. "You really know how to talk and say nothing, don't you?" he said, laughing. "I have told you, you have to have an unbending intent in order to become a man of knowledge. But you seem to have an unbending intent to confuse yourself with riddles. You insist on explaining everything as if the whole world were composed of things that can be explained. Now you are confronted with the guardian and with the problem of moving by using your will. Has it ever occurred to you that only a few things in this world can be explained your way? When I say that the guardian is really blocking your passing and could actually knock the devil out of you, I know what I mean. When I say that one can move by one's will, I also know what I mean. I wanted to teach you, little by little, how to move, but then I realized that you know how to do it, even though you say you don't." "But I really don't know how," I protested. "You do, you fool," he said sternly, and then smiled. "It reminds me of the time when someone put that kid Julio on a harvesting machine. He knew how to run it, although he had never done it before. I know what you mean, Don Juan. However, I still feel that I could not do it again, because I am not sure of what I did. A phony sorcerer tries to explain everything in the world with explanations he is not sure about," he said, "and so everything is witchcraft. But then you're no better. You also want to explain everything your way, but you're not sure of your explanations either." And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.